Hi there, welcome to this video tutorial where I'll show you how I process a seascape using luminosity masks in Photoshop. I'll start off by making some basic edits in Lightroom and then I'll take the image to Photoshop where I'll use the TK8 panel to make further edits. To know more about the TK8 panel and luminosity masks in general, visit goodlight.us. I took this photograph using a Canon R6 and an IRIX 15mm lens at a beautiful and secluded beach in coastal Karnataka a few days ago. The Canon R6 has excellent dynamic range, similar to the Sony cameras I've used. Come, let's head over to the darkroom and see the post-processing workflow. This is the Lightroom Classic interface, and I've imported a bunch of raw files taken with the Canon R6. Let's go over them. This one is in landscape mode and these are in portrait mode. They're all from the same location, taken at around the same time. Now, one thing which is important before you process any image is to zoom in and check if the image is sharp. This image is sharp here, but it is not sharp on the edges. Most likely because of a movement in the tripod. The tripod was in the sand and there was water hitting the tripod. So most likely the tripod sunk. So let's look at the other images. This one looks sharp all through. I'm going to pick one of these images with the goal of bringing out the highlights in the milky white portion of the water, enhancing the sunset colors, and then bringing out the overall exposure and contrast of the image. I like this one because there's quite a bit of milkiness in the water here as against the other images. This one is nice too because of this swirl going around here. But let's pick this image and process it. I'm going to head over to the develop module. And in the develop module, I'm going to do some basic edits before taking this image over to Photoshop. So the first thing is to go into the detail tab and reduce sharpening because I like to sharpen the image later on. And next, since this is a sunset image, a landscape, a seascape, or whatever you want to call it, it's good to have saturated colors. So I'm going to go into the calibration tab. I'm going to go into blue primary and increase the saturation quite a bit, maybe even 100%. Now what this does is it increases the saturation of the image, but very differently from the vibrance and saturation sliders which you can find in the basic tab. If this blue appears to be a little too saturated, I can go into the HSL tab, click the color picker, make sure I'm in saturation and decrease the color by moving the mouse down by holding it over the portion of the image where I want to reduce the saturation. So now the blue in this portion of the image has reduced. I can also increase the saturation and the exposure in the sky by using AI masks. So let me go here and click on the sky mask and Lightroom automatically selects the sky. And now I can change the temperature, make it a little warmer, and also decrease the exposure just a tad bit. I'm going to close this. And then in the basic tab, I'm going to increase the shadows because I want the foreground to be bright, around 70%, and make sure there's no black clipping. There's a little bit of clipping here, so let's push the blacks slider to the right till the clipping goes away. Yeah, one more thing that you could do is you could change the profile from Adobe Color to Adobe Landscape. This will make the image a little more vivid. There's a little bit of vignetting on the sides, and let's see if the profile correction corrects that. So under the lens correction tab, enable profile corrections is selected, but the make, model, and profile is not selected. So under the make, I'm going to select IRIX. I shot this with an IRIX 15mm lens, and the lens is not 11mm f4, but a 15mm f2.4. And there's still a little bit of vignetting, but we're going to crop this image because there's too much of sky. I don't want so much of sky. I want the focus more to be on the foreground. So I'm going to bring up the crop tool and I'm going to change the aspect ratio to 4:3. And I'm going to make sure that the rule of thirds is followed. So This line is on the horizon. It's not straight, so I'm going to straighten it a bit. And I'm going to click close. So the image is cropped now. Okay, this is a good starting point. Let's take this image into Photoshop. And I'm going to do that by right-clicking, going into Edit In, and Open as Smart Object in Photoshop. I'm going to open this as a Smart Object in Photoshop. Now what a Smart Object means is that when I double-click this image, all my raw edits from Lightroom are carried forward here. So all the changes that we made in Lightroom are available here. I can change these settings later on in Photoshop if I need to. At this point of time, I'm going to cancel and just leave it as it is. And I'm going to start my edits in Photoshop. This is the Photoshop UI. I'm going to be using the TK8 multi-mask panel and the TK8 combo panel. Now the TK8 multi-mask panel lets me generate luminosity masks from various sources and then modify the mask and then output the mask. We'll see how this works as we process this image. Now before I use these masks, I want to show you something. I'm going to create a dodge layer and I'm going to dodge this part of the image, basically make it brighter. Now it's nice, the image is getting brightened, but I feel that there's also a loss of contrast. So to counter this, I'm going to first make a selection and then I'm going to dodge. Now the selection is going to constrain the dodging to only that part of the image which is selected. And to make the selection, I'm going to use zone luminosity masks. So I'm going to pick a zone, which is this part of the image, slightly brighter. And you can ignore the color picker. When I click OK, what happens is that the TK8 multi-mask panel shows me a preview of the areas which are going to be selected. So all that's white is going to be selected. All that's dark, that is black to gray, is not going to be selected. And this selection is going to be self-feathering. So when I paint, it's going to look very natural. Now, if I feel that the contrast here is not up to my liking, I can always play around with these sliders. But I think at this point of time, I'm going to leave it as it is. And now I'm going to create a dodge layer. Now I have a dodge layer here. And when I dodge with an opacity of not 50%, but 30%, you can see that this part of the image is getting brighter, but the contrast remains. Likewise, I can brighten the portions of the rock which are receiving the sunlight, and also these areas where there's a little bit of milky white water. And at this point of time, when I turn this layer off and on, you can see what kind of a change it has brought. I'm going to invert this selection by going to Select, Inverse, and I'm going to hide the selection again. And now I'm going to use the Burn tool to burn those areas of the image which were initially not selected. So when I inverted the selection, the areas of the image that were initially not selected are now selected, and that selection is hidden. And I'm going to use the Burn tool to burn those areas. And this is to bring about a little more contrast in the image and bring the focus more towards this part and the sky. I'm going to burn the sky quite a bit because I want the saturation to come out and I want the sky to be dark. Okay, so now we have the dodge and burn layers. I'm going to group this layer and I'm going to call it dodge and burn. Now when I turn this group off and on, you can see what kind of a difference it has brought about. And since these are non-destructive edits, I can always go back with my paintbrush, swap the foreground and background colors, and then bring back some of the effect. If I feel this is too strong, I can always paint black and reduce the dodging effect over here. We'll just leave it like this for now. Next, I'm going to add some color. And before that, I'm going to remove this selection. Remember, the selection was hidden. This is to hide and show the selection. Right now, the selection is shown. Right now, it is hidden, shown, hidden. I'm going to remove the selection by hitting Ctrl D, and I'm going to make a fresh selection. And the fresh selection is so I can add color selectively. Now to add color in the TK8 combo panel, there is an add color option, and I can pick the color that I want to add. I'm going to add the sunset colors, and I'm going to click OK. Now nothing has happened because there is a black mask applied to this layer. If I hide this mask, you can see that the entire image has taken up this color. Let me enable the layer mask and let me paint the color selectively. So for that, again, I'm going to use luminosity masks. This time I'm going to use the luminosity based on the pixels, and I'm going to use a lights 2 or a lights 3. Okay, a lights 2 mask, because it's making a good selection of these parts of the image. And I'm going to adjust this mask a little, make it less contrasty. And I'm going to output this mask as a selection. Now what happens is that the TK8 multi-mask panel has generated the selection, but it's also hidden the selection. And you can make out that there is a selection because of the matching ants here. If I use this to show the selection, then you can see which parts of the image are selected. So these are the parts which are selected, and these are the parts which are not selected. So I'm going to hide this again, and now I'm going to paint with a white foreground. So I'm going to paint on these parts. And you can see that the color that we had selected is now getting added. So I want this part of the ocean to take on the colors of the sunset. So I'm going to paint here. I'm going to paint on the rock. And maybe there's not too much of color being added to the rock because it was not part of the selection. So let me make a fresh selection. Let me deselect this. And now let me use the lights 1 mask, make a selection, and then paint the color on the rocks. It's a very subtle change. I'm going to turn the layer off and on so you can see what's going on here. So now these parts of the rock have become a little more golden in color. And of course, the sky has also taken on the golden color. Now it's looking really good. I'm going to deselect this, and next I'm going to add a vignette. So again, there is an action for that, the TK8 combo. When I hit vignette, it asks me how much of blur I need. So a value of 380 is good. And this blur is to decide the feathering of the vignette. So again, it's a very mild effect. If I turn this layer off and on, you can see what's going on here. Now that you've added the vignette, let's see if you can make the image pop. One way of doing that is to go into the TK8 color panel and click soft pop. Again, this is a one-touch operation. You can perform the same task using the Photoshop menus and options, but this is just one click. And when I click soft pop, what the panel has done is that it's added saturation and it's also added a little bit of clarity. So now the image has really popped. If I think this is a little too strong, I can always reduce the opacity. An opacity of 75 looks good, and the image has now taken on a little more saturation, contrast, and clarity. At this point, I think I'm done with my edits in Photoshop. Now going back to the smart object, I never really used it, so I can convert this into a raster layer, because otherwise the PST file size will simply increase. So before saving, I'm going to go into Layer, Smart Objects, and then Rasterize. And now this smart object has become a normal layer. Now I'm going to hit File, Save, and Photoshop is going to save this file as a PST. This PST will be available for us to make further edits in Lightroom. Now when I head back to Lightroom, I can see that the PST file is available here. It's a 2.5 second exposure at f9 ISO 100. And when I look at the histogram, there's a little bit of gap over here. So by pushing the white slider, I can make sure there are no gaps, which means there's no loss of contrast. And this has increased the brightness in this part of the image. If I feel that it's too bright or it's too blue, I can always come to the HSL tab and decrease the saturation of the colors here, so it looks a little natural. And I can even decrease the luminance if I feel this is too bright, just a tad bit. And to make sure that no gaps over here, I can turn on my shadow clipping and push the slider to the left. And I think this is looking good. I'm going to add some sharpening. That's the last step. So I'm going to go into the detail tab and I'm going to add a sharpening of 60%. But I'm also going to mask the sharpening by holding the Alt or Option key and pushing the masking slider till only the high threshold areas have the sharpening applied, which is basically the rocks and a little bit of the ocean. Okay, so we've added sharpening. We can also add a little bit of post-crop vignetting if we feel we need a little more vignetting. Let's see what this does. Now, I think it's better as it is, so I'm going to bring this effect back to 0. So this is the final image processed in Lightroom and Photoshop using luminosity masks. I hope you liked the video. Thank you for watching.